I hope most of you are going to be able to come out to the Fountain Lake Farm immediately following my talk, so that you'll be able to really see it and feel it under your souls. And I normally, the talk I'm giving you right now, or at least the slide tray that I brought along, normally takes me a good hour to go through the way I'd like to go through. I know Ed Schofield and probably Frank Buskey and Grace and some of the others faced the same dilemma. So with that, why don't we just go right to the slides? And Bill, if you would dim the lights, please. Back up one, Maria, please. You had it there for a second. There you go. Kurt mentioned the magic of the sand and the influence that it had on particularly Aldo Leopold, and in fact, even in the title of his book that I realized was not chosen by Leopold, but ended up to be a Sand County Almanac. After having lived up here now for a couple of years, I'm equally as fascinated with the magic of the sand, and I'm still discovering some of the secrets that it holds. So we're going to begin the slideshow here, the presentation, with a slide that I think is characteristic of the sand and the value of the sand. We see here a sandhill crane track, and if it wasn't for the sand in this part of the state, no doubt we wouldn't have wild places like crane marshes today. It's simply harder to fill a silo in sand, and because it's poor in terms of its soil nutrition, or poor economically, and as Leopold came to call it, it's poor land but rich country. And he also elaborated that land is someplace where mortgages and corn grows, where rich country is something that, like the sand, is someplace that maybe individual perception and appreciation and a love and sensitivity for wild nature may grow. Okay, with that, we'll go to the title slide. This is what it was supposed to say, George, is a pioneer homestead that influenced a nation. Okay, when the Muirs came from Milwaukee, they arrived at Milwaukee by steamer from Buffalo, New York, and they came across approximately 100 miles of virgin prairie from Milwaukee to Kingston, Wisconsin. And the virgin Wisconsin landscape looked something like this. Okay. And after a couple of days, a local farmer and land agent by the name of Alexander Gray led Daniel Muir, that was John's father, to this precious place that would become Fountain Lake Farm. Okay. This is the reason that Daniel Muir chose to call the farm Fountain Lake Farm. It's because of the network of bubbling springs or fountains, spring heads, all of which feed the lake that are in the meadow just below the house that I'm fortunate enough to live in now. And this is a shot showing a pair of sandhill cranes down at one of the Muir Springs in the meadow, and that was taken just last year. And this particular pair did launch one chick last year, so it is a suitable nesting habitat for cranes. Okay. This is a sketch that Muir made in the 1860s, and it appeared in the childhood autobiography, The Story of My Boyhood and Youth. And it's simply called Muir's Lake, or Fountain Lake in Perrins, and the Garden Meadow. Muir's Lake was the name that the neighbors gave it, but Fountain Lake was the original name and the one that I feel is historically significant. And he's got here sketched from the roof of the Baroque shanty. He told me where he was when he sketched that scene, so that when my initial research was to discover and document where the Muir farmstead, the original farmstead buildings were, and what the spatial arrangement on the site was of those buildings. So I've spent a lot of time with this sketch. Okay. This beautiful farmstead meadow lying warm in the spring sunshine, nature streaming into me, wooingly teaching her wonderful glowing lessons, every wild lesson a love lesson, not whipped but charmed into me. Oh, that glorious Wisconsin wilderness. This, to me, is an important title slide because in the field of historic preservation, landscape architecture, landscape history, what have you, there is, at least in academia, there's a dichotomy where you either branch off to look at cultural artifacts on the landscape, that is, people-built things, or you favor the natural features of the landscape, those that are put there by nature in their pristine form. I think that not unlike the cup nest of a robin, for instance, in a pioneer lilac in an old homestead, that settlement response, that immigrant response or pioneer response to a setting or to a landscape is no different. And so we as human beings then, as being mammals, another animal, do fit very well into as an ingredient, we'll say, in the landscape. Okay. So that bridges that, I think, quite nicely. Both are gone, passenger pigeons and the Muir building. This appeared in National Geographic. It's kept out in Stockton, California at the University of the Pacific in the Muir Archives. All that is left outside of the, it's not quite true that there's a little more that's remaining of the Baroque shanty. Actually, the sillstones are there. And the accompanying lilacs, there's a beautiful pair of lilacs that's blooming today that used to flank each side of this building. And this was basically a little lean-to or garret-style structure that was built into the hill above the spring, or above that beautiful meadow that we saw. And the first contingent of Muirs that came over here in the spring of 1849, it was an incomplete, it was not the whole family. And they built this in a day or two from rough hewn white and bur oak, and lived in there through that one summer season into the fall. And then finally in November, when the substantial farmhouse was built, they called, as John said, the softer side of the Muir family over from Dunbar, Scotland. And then they came, and by the time that they arrived, the house was ready. Okay, this also becomes very important in trying to document the farmstead there, the physical features or the build features of the farmstead. The top is an original road view. It's a photo that is dated 1863. It shows John Muir sitting here with his sister Sarah Muir, the person that planted the lilacs. This is Sarah's son George. I should say this is her daughter Cecilia. This is son George. And if you look at the bottom here, then that's a sketch again from the story of my boyhood and youth that Muir made while he was still in Wisconsin. That was made in about 1862, the summer of 1862. He came back to Fountain Lake Farm after time at the University in Madison, and this appears in his journal then. It says our first Wisconsin home on the hill near the shanty built in the summer of 1849. I put these on the same slide to show you what a meticulous, as a sketcher, he didn't miss any details. The planting arrangement of the sober maples, the difference in the crown, say in that oak tree, and the difference in the form in the actual photo. Even the architectural details in terms of the window and door arrangement, the number of panes, the scale, the double chimneys with the lightning rod, and the whole bit. There was an argument going on that when I first started researching this, that how could he have sketched these things back in 1908 at Klamath Lake when he was being followed around by Harriman's secretary, and could sketch it with that kind of recall. But as it turns out, indeed, they were sketched in the 1860s. When I first began my efforts in trying to locate the original buildings, I, of course, went up to the area and would ask old local folks if they could ever heard stories about where the house was or where the barn was or whatever. And I would get an answer something like this: they were over there. And of course, that wasn't good enough. And I started looking at the published references, and I came across this. This is a book that was published in 1973 called The Trail of the Serpent, and its subtitle was The Lore and Legend of the Upper Fox River Valley, co-authored between Bob Gard and Elaine Reitz, who's a local historian from Neshkoro, which is in Marquette County. And as you can see, it was captioned on page 67, John Muir's First Wisconsin Home. I had trouble with this from the beginning because it didn't fit the architectural description that Muir gave, for instance, in his autobiography or in other unpublished writings. Okay. So it took me a while to unravel this one. I also, in a book that was published in 1924 by Fred Holmes called Alluring Wisconsin, he also assumed that, and this maybe is where Bob Gard assumed, trusted Fred Holmes' research. But Holmes says, we came upon an old, unpainted, weather-beaten, deserted farmhouse that was fast falling into ruin. Behind it was the glistening lake. Well, after I researched this, and I was fortunate enough to interview a couple of oldsters that have since passed away that grew up here. In fact, Ben Hull, who Bill Edwards at the back of the room knew well, was even the town of Buffalo assessor back in the 20s. Turns out Ben lived in this house for 4 or 5 years shortly after he was married. And without showing him the picture of this house, I had him sketch me a floor plan. And he was 93 when he did this, and it turned out that everything in terms of the window arrangement, where the doors were, where the chimneys were located, so on and so forth, the form of the house, the scale, it turned out to be this house. And he recalls that this house was built by an Irish settler by the name of Hugh McGuinn, and it was located just northeast of a granite marker that now stands in the park. Some of you have probably seen that. It would be very close to County F. I was also told, and this was published in local newspapers, that on a farm that's within eyesight of where I live was a wing that was taken, salvaged from the old Muir house before the Muir house burned to the ground in the first decade of this century. And after, again, on-site research and so on, interviewing people, measuring the wing, it turns out that indeed it is a wing off of a house, but it's off of the Hugh McGuinn house that I just showed you. Okay. So, with no, again, human-built artifacts left to help me along, I started trying to read the landscape itself. And the popular story up here with the local people, passed on from contemporaries of the Muirs and so on, was that there was a house at one time between these old lilacs. And the lilacs, I've documented, it's written that Sarah planted these. They were brought over from Dunbar, Scotland with the first group of Muirs in 1849, the spring of 1849. And Sarah put those on each side of the little shanty that spring. Obviously, if they were going to bring lilacs over and leaving Scotland in February, arriving here in late April, they weren't going to wait and plant them, say, in November when the main house was readied. They set them out immediately on each side of the little shanty. So this is where the Baroque shanty sits. And again, Bill Edwards, who's an emeritus professor of philosophy from Emory back there, caught wind of what I was doing, and it happened that in July of 1942, and I think, correct me, Bill, if I'm wrong, you were fresh out of high school or still a senior or something, but he went out to the Fountain Lake Farm site and took 5 photos. And they turned out to be the only photos really in existence of the site before the little cottage that I live in was built. Now, so here's 1942. These are silver maple trees. And if you go back even farther than this and look at the earliest aerial photos from the 1930s, these silver maple trees really stand out, and of course they're in a line, and their stature in the 30s and the 40s was actually much greater than it is today. They're in the process of dieback now. I'm doing my best to, unlike the Muir locust, I think I'm doing my best to keep these around. But basically the depression then, or where the farmhouse sat, would be pretty much in the center with these big trees surrounding the depression. Obviously they were planted for shade. Okay. Another one of Bill's photos, both lilacs here. This is where the shanty would have been, and that's where the lane now goes in amongst the maples. Okay. This is a photo that was dated 1920. It's in the iconographic archives at the State Historical Society. It shows a man by the name of David Owens, who is a local farmer. He lives down the road from Fountain Lake Farm, poking around in some depression or another. It wasn't specific as to what depression it was. There's a number of depressions on the site. Turns out that this is not the house depression. It was a smaller shed. Okay. This was also with the same collection at State Historical, and this on the back of it, again, 1920, probably taken by the same photographer that took the previous slide. And it was labeled the doorstep stone to John Muir's home. So kind of make a mental image of the shape of that stone, the topography, this striation here, this indentation, because the next slide is important. Okay, it's a Bill, this is from your collection again. It's not a good picture, but it's a heck of a lot better than nothing. But it shows the depression here. I know my maples now, the John Muir's maples, well enough to recognize that one. And here's this stone again. I believe it's this stone. And the people that built the house on top of this depression recognized the stone as well. And it turns out the stone is still on the site, encased in cement now in my basement somewhere. But anyway, that's what the old, obviously reclaimed, partially reclaimed cellarway depression looked like, and that's very typical for an immigrant cellar situation in the sands. They were strictly nothing like our contemporary full basements. They were just used for vegetable storage, garden stock storage, and so on. And of course, they I think recognized that an airspace below the house was good in terms of preventing rot and so on. Okay. So this little house, this photo was taken in 1948 or 9, but here's one of the lilacs to give you a sense of where we are. Big trees again, taken in winter time. This little house then was built on the old cellar depression in 1947, and I've interviewed a good number of people that actually worked on digging out the cellar depression and helped build the house that sits on it now. I'm very satisfied with the documentation I was able to come up with. The Park Service was here all week. They just left yesterday, and they also seemed pleased with the findings. Okay. And another shot of that little house that I live in now. This woman now is in her 40s. This is one of the enormous maples there in the front yard that I believe was Muir planted. So when I bought the place in December of 1986, and really came on it by accident, there wasn't a real estate sign by the road or anything. I had been researching this site intimately for 2 years by the time I bought it. And so I had a good working relationship established with the people that owned the site. And I did tell them that if they ever chose to part with it, please let me know before they listed it with a realtor. At that time, I was thinking more in terms of the public good. I was either going to act as a liaison for the Sierra Club or the Nature Conservancy or somebody like that might be interested in purchasing it. And I never thought any more about it, and they assured me they weren't interested in selling. And they came about it by inheritance, and they really never fully appreciated the historical significance of the site. And I received a phone call then in autumn of 1986, and the gentleman asked if I would be interested in buying the property. And I could hardly believe it. And he said, "I don't want to sell it to a nature group." I said, "I'll sell it to you." So I had a house in Madison at the time, and I quickly sold that and closed on this one the day after I closed on the house in Madison. Okay. Today the house looks like this. I should say that photo from before was very flattering. The house had sat vacant for about 30 years, used only by deer hunters for a weekend or so in the fall. And this is what the house, as I said, looks like. The Amish, I hired an Amish carpentry crew, a local Amish crew, and they've done the remodeling on the house to make it much more livable. I suppose it's gentrified or yuppified, but it in no way is supposed to be a replica of the Muir house. However, aesthetically, in terms of how it fits in with the setting, obviously it's natural wood and native stone. It complements the landscape, I think. The choice of the cedar beveled siding, the Muir house would have had pine, but the dimensions of the beveled siding are the same as on the original Muir Fountain Lake farmhouse.
What about the basic of the house there? Is it the same as well? In other words, the directional?
Yeah, it's laid horizontally, you mean, instead of vertically?
No, I mean north-south and west.
It's oriented, of course, identically on the site. In terms of the site orientation, it's identical to the original farmhouse, yes. The Scots, again, like so many ethnic groups, were frugal. They had to be. And if at all possible, when they generally got their 160, they tried to position it facing south. Of course, they realized, just common sense would tell them, that the sun was a real friend in terms of keeping houses that were hard to heat warm. So the Scotch people I've seen in the area, it's very characteristic to see the Scotch building high on a hill with a wide view and always facing south if possible. And this is true of Fountain Lake Farm, it's true of Hickory Hill, the second Muir farm too. Yeah, both of them. So, in other words, south then would be going through the mums there, so the big trees here in a line are filtering the sunlight then to the south. Okay. So when I got there, in terms of the beyond just again the human built things, It was my ambition to restore the landscape finally back to a pre-settlement condition, or the proximate condition that it would have been in when the Muirs arrived. And as Kurt said, that was one of the very last things that Aldo Leopold had on his mind, evidently. He did write a letter a week before his death urging Ernie Swift, the old WCD director, to acquire the Fountain Lake property and restore it and perhaps call it the state's first natural area. And I think that idea pretty much went to the grave with Leopold. And then 3 years later, Norman Fassett spearheaded a drive to acquire the Parfrey's Glen site, and that became Wisconsin's first natural area. But anyway, it was in 1960, the previous landowner planted a dog-hair thick pine plantation. It's a red pine plantation. Okay. So the first thing I did was clear cut it, and even with the heavy equipment in there, we saved the shagbark hickories. It's a very characteristic tree of the bur oak and the shagbark hickory as a savanna combination are characteristic of the Fountain Lake Farm. This is a shot of the restoration or the clearing process. I call it the battlefield phase of restoration, where all the stumps now, the trees are cut, the stumps are actually pulled out now. They're sitting on the earth drying, waiting to be pushed into piles and burned. This is what we use to pull the stumps. Unlike John Muir and his brothers and sisters and so on out there grubbing and axing away, this thing is one of 6 commercial stump pullers in the nation. They were developed by Georgia Pacific down south for use in the loblolly pine or the southern yellow pine fields. So that really made short order of the stumpage. This is what it looks like when we started to burn the slash. Okay. And this is where it's pretty well cleared away. The last pile's burning. And clearing red cedars, or the eastern juniper really is what it is. It's not a true cedar. Oftentimes after agriculture moves on, if there's a seed source nearby, red cedar comes in and forms very dense cedar fields that eventually will become glades or forests. And this was the case here, that the last corn was tilled on this site or grown on this site in 1949. So it had about the best part of 40 years to sit, and so these cedars started encroaching. And what we're trying to do is return the landscape back to a pre-settlement grassland, prairie complex, savanna. So they had to go. And also then when I arrived there, there was a wall of vegetation on that slope just below the farmhouse, where the farmhouse stood, that blocked my historic viewshed out to the Muir Meadow, to the famous spring meadow, the Muir's sacred garden spot, he called it. Okay. So I clear cut that, and that opened up this view, which is only a partial restoration. That's only not even half restored. But it did at least afford a view similar to what Muir sketched in the autobiography. It also opened up the breezes for circulation. It's amazing the difference it made. Eventually now, through prescribed burning and also selective removal of some of the tamaracks and red osier dogwood that's encroaching, we're going to return that viewshed as close to possible as what it was when John Muir was living there. Okay, this is a slide that I like to show to undergraduates that are just coming out of the university in one of the natural sciences or greater ecological fields, disciplines that think they're all set to tackle this whole new art of restoration ecology. But really, our efforts at healing the earth and sort of restoring or correcting our atrocities toward nature is just like this monarch that's just emerged from the chrysalis. And now we're going to rapidly go through some Muir-mentioned landscape components, some flora here. This is the cardinal flower that grows in the meadow. And the prairie chicken, which used to come around the Muir farmhouse, and in the winter when food was low, they would feed the prairie chickens, and prairie chickens were very abundant then. The prairie chicken, for all practical purposes, has been replaced by this bird, which is a Korean or a Chinese bird. It's a pheasant. It's a ringneck pheasant, and I'm just going to quickly, no, go back, Maria. No, I can't give any lecture that mentions pheasants and prairie chickens without blasting the present day policies that the state has. Right now, the state is, we have a marvelous state-of-the-art facility at Poinet for the propagation of pheasants, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's ecologically insane to be propagating these exotic birds strictly for shooting opportunities when our native gallinaceous or upland grassland birds are going by the boards. Every single one of our native grouse, whether it's the sharp-tail, the prairie chicken, even the ruffed grouse, is being shot out now in local areas, and the bobwhite quail, which isn't a grouse, but it's certainly one of our native grassland birds. All of those birds are on the wane, and yet we still keep pumping millions of dollars, personnel, these facilities that could easily be altered to raise our native birds and replenish those birds. And hunting is not the issue with me right now. I mean, they can go ahead and hunt our native birds. That would be a step in the right direction from hunting these exotic birds that ecologically directly compete with our native birds. So that's something that hopefully before I'm dead is going to be an issue that I'm going to go head-to-head with them on. Okay. The eastern bluebird, another one of my personal favorites that we have been aggressively trying to restore to the Fountain Lake Farm. We have about 40 bluebird boxes up now that we regularly monitor, and they've been responding very well. This is a slide entitled Cooperation, and this again is just some of the things that Muir was influenced by and exposed to when he was growing up on the farm. The magic of these turtles in Fountain Lake. Foxpups. And frogs. The leopard frog, most of us took swimming lessons from other people. Muir took his swimming lessons from the leopard frogs, and when his father told him that it was time to learn how to swim, he said, go down to the lake and watch the frogs, and you'll become a good swimmer if you study them carefully. So Dan Muir wasn't all bad. He was a Bible-beating Calvinist. There's no question about it. He'd drive his horses, his wife, his daughters, and sons right into the ground. But he did recognize the magic in nature, and there's another time when he explained the beauty of a wood duck to Muir that I don't have time now to quote, but it's... Okay, Muir writes about the lilies and the round-stem bulrush that formed the periphery of the lake. And a crane chick. This is one that, I'm cheating. I did a project for the International Crane Foundation a couple of years ago. This is from their file, but we do have chicks in the meadow. Prickly pear is a plant that we have already reintroduced. It was extirpated probably back in about the 20s or 30s from the site, and now we have a couple good populations going again. And same with the prairie rose or the wild rose. And we've used children, and there's also certainly an educational, inspirational feature to this whole thing, and getting impressionable age children out there collecting prairie seeds, and we've also been doing that. Last year, a little earlier in May, but a little over a year ago, volunteers came out and hand broadcast the tilled area back to prairie. So the seeding is just a year old. So right now it looks pretty much like an old wheat field, but in time it should resemble one of our native prairies. We're also using seed, I should add, from in terms of genetic proximity. We're trying to stay as close to getting seed sources, in other words, as close to the site as possible. So we've been doing a lot of collecting in old cemeteries, along roads, that kind of railroads and so on. And fortunately, there's a prairie nursery within 10 miles or so of the site, so we're also using them. And we did burn, the site's been burned twice since I've been there. This is a burn that took place in late March of 1988. And like I was going to say about the fire, like Kurt's Yellowstone lodge poles, the prairie also, or the open grassland, is a fire-dependent community. Okay, now we'll go to the bobwhite quail, one of the birds I mentioned that is not getting enough professional attention at all. There's just simply no good grassroots field data on a lot of our native stuff. But this shows a quail that was singing on the site late last summer as part of the landscape restoration. Of course, also considering the zoological component beyond just the botanical facade. And we did release several coveys of bobwhites on the site, and they're singing this morning, in fact. This just shows me taking one of those coveys in a cage to one of the release sites or the hack sites. Okay. This is, of course, a prairie in its beautiful form. The weeds are gone. but it's basically what we're shooting for is shooting stars. Okay. And this is a savanna community in Oak Savanna. The community at the Muir Homestead really is an oak hickory savanna. I think that would be an ecologically would be a more accurate description of it. It's beyond just black oaks and bur oaks and white oaks. But wait a minute. But at any rate, this is someday, again, this is pretty much what that landscape looked like when the Muirs pulled in there on their wagon. And long after we're all gone, hopefully it'll resemble a situation like this. And I want to throw this in. We've been talking a lot about black locust trees today. It's very ironic that Muir received his first lesson, his formal botanical lesson at the university on a black locust, on that particular species. Because now in the Central Sands, there's no bigger menace than the black locust. And it's a tree that was introduced in the 1930s by the Soil Conservation Service for erosion control. And now, because as Bruce alluded to earlier, it can reproduce every way possible, either by vegetative reproduction through root sprouts or through seed. And it's my nemesis. We're really trying to eradicate black locust now from the site. So it's kind of an interesting turn in that it happens to be one of Muir's favorite trees, I guess. Then also with the prairie restoration, we're putting out some of the old-fashioned garden variety flowers around the house that were there when the Muirs were there, and hollyhock is one of them. And this is a shot of Muir taken in 1863 in Madison. Here's his famous clock desk that's in the lobby at the State Historical Society. That was taken before the State Historical Society encased it in. You got to go back a couple minutes. No. This shot was taken before the State Historical Society encased this clock in a glass or a plastic cube that it's in now, and I think probably, and correct me, Jack, if I'm wrong, it was probably a response to pilferage that was going on. People were taking parts off of this thing to the point where they still today can't get it to run again.
Pre-1950s, it's for rebuilding in the society, and at that point, I think we're on the 4th floor.
Okay.
They made all kinds of new cases in the 50s and put everything in the side cases.
Okay. Quite a contraption at any rate. The popular way to describe that is a Rube Goldberg contraption. Okay, this just is an example of some of the other inventions that Muir came up with, more magical contraptions than practical inventions, I think. But this is one of them that's it's copied from the original that's on file in the iconographic collection at State Historical. And I think it depicts, of course, the settlement patterns, early homesteading, basically clearing the forest and savanna and tilling the prairie. But this very well could be the Fountain Lake. It resembles the Fountain Lake house in a general way. And this may be Observatory Hill, which is the high point that's a couple miles to the north and to the east of the farm. And of course, it's some kind of a solar clock, and it looks to me like it's in backwards because it shouldn't be 11, 12, whatever. Okay. And this is a picture of Sylvester Adrian, a local historian and man that used to run a resort on the Fox River and had a special interest in John Muir and local history, particularly the Native American bands. And he's passed on. I didn't get a chance to get to know this man. I missed him by some months. But he really spearheaded the local effort, the grassroots preservation effort, to secure the lands surrounding Fountain Lake in perpetuity, protect them or preserve them in perpetuity. So when I came along a couple of years ago and drafted this proposal to the Park Service to create a National Historic Site out of the boyhood home, it's a very secondary thing compared to what this man spearheaded and really what the county recognized. Had it not been for their efforts in the early 1950s, and the park, of course, was dedicated in 1957, okay, this is likely what we would have on the shores of Muir's beloved lake. There's absolutely no zoning whatsoever in the Buffalo Township where the farm is. None at all. You can do as you damn please as long as you can keep up the mortgages and the taxes. And Thus, we have this kind of ticky-tacky development along the Fox River. This site is only a mile and a half from where I live. And so it's something that, again, needs a local grassroots effort to, we've got to get some good zoning in this township. The park today is a product of neglect. Marquette County is economically a depressed county. They simply do not have the money or the expertise to oversee the park and really take care of it the way it should be taken care of as a tribute, respectful tribute, hopefully, to a great man like Muir. So you do see this kind of thing where you've got a lot of local vandalism. The area is treated as kind of a local playground.